First up, let's talk about cancel culture. And I mentioned that we will be talking about J.K. Rowling and her letter with other academics and so forth, and also Donald Trump and his speech at Mount Rushmore. But firstly, let's get into this letter. This is, it made headlines in the last couple of days, signed by over 150 writers, academics and public figures, including such luminaries as J.K. Rowling, as I mentioned, but also Margaret Atwood, Salman Rushdie, Noam Chomsky, a real range of people from all over the political spectrum, from different countries and all sorts. And the letter really is an appeal to reject cancel culture. And let me quote the part of the letter with which I agree, which is the second half. It says this, it's very good actually. It says, "It is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders in a spirit of panicked damage control are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study. And the heads of organisations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk aversion among writers, artists and journalists who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement." Now, they are mentioning here an issue that many people are just flat out aware of. They're concerned because it's really starting to knock on the door in the realm of writers and the arts and academia and things like that. It's been going on in many sectors for a while, this idea of cancel culture. That if somebody transgresses a narrow bandwidth of acceptable speech and thought, if they go outside it even once, even as they're saying here by accident in some cases, then there must be swift retribution. And that is in the form of, we say being cancelled, but, it is, for example, losing your job. It is, for example, losing your contracts. It is, for example, losing your credibility, your accreditations, and all this kind of thing. As in, you think that way, you've said that, well, all right, you're finished. Okay? Now, there's nothing too controversial in that for many people. Many people experience it as political correctness and that narrow bandwidth of what they feel they can and can't say. That's how they experience it. But here they are saying, well, actually, you know what? People in our sector are afraid of this now. We're afraid of this. We don't know when it's going to come for us, whether we will say something wrong. They conclude with this, which I think is very good. It says, "This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society." That's a good point, It's not always a totalitarian government that can suppress speech and debate and thought and that kind of thing. It can be society. An intolerant society or sufficient intolerant people in positions of power in society or institutions that can do the job. It says it invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. They're saying it's a threat to democracy. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. And then they say the way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. So they're saying, look, cancel culture wants to get rid of certain ideas. It's going to fail at its own goal. It's not going to get rid of ideas. You can't get rid of ideas. The best you can hope to do with ideas is rebut them clearly, dispel them openly, and see that those bad ideas don't actually get big-time traction. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that view. Now, this got a mixed reaction from a lot of quarters. I read a lot of tweets. I read a lot of criticism of it. The critics basically said two things. They said, firstly, there was the outright denial of cancel culture. It just doesn't exist, they said. It's just a made-up concept by people. Well, I think most of the people who said that are simply disingenuous. They know that it exists. They know that it's happening. But they're on the right side and they actually support it. And so they're not going to call it out. There are those who I think are genuinely ignorant, and that's probably because they actually have these PC views and that just hasn't entered their orbit yet. But hey, like I'll say in a minute, that was the case for someone like Germaine Greer. It was the case for J.K. Rowling, case for others who have suffered far worse fates. And then one day, wham, you realise that you're outside the permissible boundary. The second thing they said, so firstly, it doesn't exist. The second criticism was that these whiny people must be just whining because there's no fear for them. They have huge audiences. What are they complaining about? Well, you know, and this is one example. There's a tweet by Judd Legum, who's a political staffer and a journalist and whatnot in the US, and he says, "This letter perfectly illustrates my issue with the cancel culture trope. The signatories of this letter have bigger platforms and more resources than most other humans. They are not being silenced in any way." Well, actually, the way I see it is that these people, they're simply naming a rising trend, which will ultimately threaten their platforms. And indeed, it already does. It's knocking at the door. That is to say that their platforms are not yet taken away from them. But they have seen enough cases, they are astute enough to know that this trend is not going away. And this is for many of us with non-PC opinions, just the reality that we live in. We know this. There is nothing whatsoever even slightly offbeat about what's being said here. This is happening. Take my own country of Australia, and where most of the viewers are from. Professor Peter Reid at James Cook University sacked for publishing a dissenting view on the condition of the Great Barrier Reef. Right? This idea that pushed against the climate change mantra. Or Israel Folau, the one with which I have the strongest personal connection, sacked by Rugby Australia. Why? Because he put a verse of scripture on his Instagram account, and this was some kind of statement of inclusion by Rugby Australia by excluding him and his religion. And he was, you know, one of their best players, if not their best, or Drew Pavlo in recent times at the University of Queensland, expelled. Why? Well, because of his pro-Hong Kong democracy protests and things like that. And that's been quite a shameful episode, actually. And these are alongside, those are the high-profile ones, the ones that have been famous or have happened to more famous people, especially in Izzy's case. But there's others that are less famous. And I could sit here and I could cite 4 dozen examples easily for you, which I might do in another video, actually, just to show you in the last few years how ordinary folks have been cancelled time and time again. You could look at Ian Shepherd, school teacher who was put under disciplinary proceedings for his opinions on same-sex marriage, or Jason Tay, a photographer who was hauled before a tribunal for sharing his faith with a client, or Byron and Kira Hordyke, who have been declined admission to the foster care system because of their Christian faith, or Dr. Jereth Cock, a general practitioner who was deregistered and still cannot practice medicine now for, oh gosh, must be a year just about, and there's no hope really for him at the moment, it seems, because of his conservative opinions online. Deregistered as a doctor. Or Josh Lawless, a university student suspended for praying with a friend. I could keep going. I won't. But internationally, this is a big deal as well. I was just thinking of the passing of Sir Roger Scruton recently. He was a luminary. He was a man with tremendous academic pedigree, a guy who you'd think, you know, for heaven's sake, don't cancel him. You know, he's too important. Well, he faced that in his last days on this earth. Or indeed this letter itself that I just read to you from these 150 or so people. It has specific examples in mind. So when it says editors are fired for running controversial pieces, well, that'd be New York Times opinion editor James Bennett, forced to resign last month for allowing a piece by Senator Tom Cotton, which said the government should use the military to control civil unrest over Black Lives Matter. Forced to resign just a month ago. Or they say books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Well, that's a reference to a novel, American Dirt, about illegal immigration by someone who was not an illegal immigrant, and therefore there was some kind of weird appropriation debate about that sort of thing, and that was a problem. Well, they weren't the same ethnicity of the immigrants or something like that. Anyway, you get the drift. There's a whole lot of examples in mind here. And this cancel culture is something that ordinary people just experience every day as political correctness. The restriction on what they feel they can and they cannot say, the culture in their workplaces which demands conformism, the sense of stifling. And you know, I hear people literally every day tell me about this. I'm approached in the street, I'm sent messages all the time. This is how people feel. I remember at the height of the Israel Folau stuff, I'd have people coming up to me multiple times a day and saying, thanks for speaking when we can't. Why not? Well, it's this political correctness. It's this cancel culture. It's because they're working in law firms, they're working in financial institutions, they're working in universities, they're at schools, they're doing all of these things, and they fear. We're seeing a growth in a new mindset. It's a mindset that says that you will no longer be left alone to believe what you want to believe. That's a big development in culture, you know. It's a change. In recent memory, we were far more inclined to leave people alone with their differences, especially if those differences merely amounted to thought and opinion. But change is afoot. More and more, if you are found guilty of wrongthink, especially if you dare to express that wrongthink in words, you will be ruined. It might be your job, it might be your reputation, it might be your contracts, it might be your relationships, whatever it is, they'll come for you. Some are high profile enough to survive. You know, I mentioned Izzy a couple of times, so I'll mention him again. I mean, he went through a lot. It was terrible. But you might say that it looks like he's managed to survive. but there's many people who aren't high profile enough to survive. You talk to people who are not within the bounds of political correctness, who, for example, had academic university careers or careers as artists in the artistic world. I know some of them, and they will tell you that it's cost them their future. It has cost them their future. Now, the signatories to this letter go further, and there's two lessons I want to pull from this. And this is the first. They go further and they point out that this is a threat to democracy, and therefore the freedoms of the most powerless. And I think that's absolutely correct. It must be correct if you think about it, because if we accept that certain opinions absolutely cannot and must not be ventilated, or certain things cannot and must not be mentioned, even by accident, then nobody can be trusted, especially those who have not been inducted into the right way to think. And who are they? Well, they are what Hillary Clinton called the basket of deplorables, the people who, who are just ordinary voters, who are considered to be ignorant and racist and bigoted and uneducated and conspiracy theory ridden and populist, and people who speak their minds and don't think all the sanctified things that one is taught at a Sandstone or Ivy League university. Those sorts of people. It's astonishing to me for a movement which is so concerned on its face about power. Boy, they don't seem to take into account the way in which their ideas disempower the most powerless. Ordinary voters who find their voice at the ballot box. I was reflecting on this recently, actually. Pauline Hanson she was excluded from the Today Show because she said some things on there which they said were racist. I haven't had the advantage of watching them, but I'm sure it's an exaggeration. But anyway, and I thought about her and I thought, well, Pauline Hanson's problem is that she's inarticulate. But here's the thing. Most Australians are inarticulate. She speaks her mind. Well, most Australians speak their mind. Welcome to the real world. But see, those are the worst kinds of people for the cancel culture types. The more significant people who haven't been taught how to think and how to speak. This is why the Democrats in America want to get rid of the Electoral College, because it silences the voices of the rednecks, the people in the country areas. They no longer have the voice that they have today. Now, this silencing of speech is baked into the DNA of left-wing movements. It's affected heavily by postmodernist and Marxist thought because that's a system of thinking that says that truth claims are about power and control and nothing more noble than that. And so if you want to wrest the power off the powerful people, which is what these movements are all about, you need to cancel them, you need to shut them down. There's no other way about it. There's command and control. That's the only solution. Total authority over who says what and where they're allowed to say it. And no platforming is the only solution. Cancel culture on steroids is the only solution because the movements do not believe in any kind of debate at all. It's a totalitarian mindset. Not to say that we have totalitarianism now, but simply to say that is where it must lead if allowed to go free. And it's interesting, none of these academic and literary figures, it seems, or very few of them, are really right-wing. They spend an awful lot of time in the letter bashing Donald Trump. They've realised that cancel culture is even coming for them. Political correctness can come for anyone. If you're one of these people who says that, there are some things which people should never be able to say, and that this is a justified response to some of the things that have been said, and some of those cases, or many of those cases, should have gone ahead, well, bear this in mind. There is no guarantee that you will remain within the ever-narrowing parameter of PC groupthink. I mentioned Germaine Greer. I mentioned J.K. Rowling. The examples are endless. The boundaries of what is acceptable are narrowing, and everyone is running a risk. That's my first point. This is a totalitarian mindset, and I wouldn't assume that anyone's safe. But here's the other thing which I really like about this, and it is that I think the solution, in large part, is effectively what these people have done. Strength in numbers. During the Israel-Folau matter, the best thing that could have happened would be for every Christian sports person to post that same scripture on their Instagram accounts. Strength in numbers. If there's only a couple of snipers, they can deal with one head coming over the trench wall, or 2 or 3 or 6. They can't deal with hundreds. And this is the thing. These PC types are a minority of people. They happen to have disproportionately powerful positions because they've set their life to that end. But my goodness, if we had strength in numbers on any number of these things, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. They actually rely on us going quietly. They rely on a failure of courage. And here we have more than 150 people standing together They can't cancel them all. They just can't. There's too many. It's too widespread. I think there's a lesson in that for us. You know, one of the most frequently repeated phrases in the Bible is be strong and courageous. It comes up time and time again. And the famous instance in Joshua where it says, be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. We need to recover some courage. And we need to stand with each other, even when people do things that aren't exactly what we would have done. But for the sake of, you know, some of these issues that really matter, I think there needs to be courage. And someone needs to stick their head above the parapet. But when they do, let's set ourselves to more and more be committed to supporting those that do. Because these people, as I said, they rely on a failure of courage. And let us not be that group, which actually were so many, and yet through a simple failure of moral fibre and courage, we would allow this kind of mindset to prevail. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe by hitting the icons below, and make sure you hit the grey bell as well so you get notified when there's a new video. And if you want to watch more, you can click on the links right about here. Thank you.